another year's war is another couple of 100,000 dead, and I don't think anybody can justify that. And the Russian economy is in free fall anyway at the moment. As far as the military goes, I think when people like me look at it, we're sort of thinking that it's going to take Russia 10 years to rebuild a military that once again NATO would look east and think, gosh, that's something that we need to be concerned about. So I think militarily now Russia is probably a spent force. Sure, if we wait another year, but I think I probably, like most people in the world, don't want to see any more death, and really want peace as quickly as possible. And if it can be done now, fine.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hanson. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Colonel Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, a regular guest here on Frontline. He's a former commander of the Royal Tank Regiment who served in operations during the First Gulf War, as well as in Cyprus, Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq and Afghanistan, commanding main battle tanks for around 24 years. On top of that, Hamish also commanded NATO's Rapid Reaction Chemical, Biological and Radiological Nuclear Battalion, and is a Biosecurity Fellow at Magdalen College, Cambridge. Hamish, it's always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now we're going to come on in a moment to your recent trip to Syria, because I'll be fascinated to hear your takeaways from that and what you found on the ground in Syria. First, I want to talk about the situation with regards to the war in Ukraine. We're recording this less than a week out from Donald Trump returning to the White House. And there is this sense that both sides, Russia and Ukraine, are trying to improve their position on the ground as much as possible ahead of any potential peace talks, hence why you're seeing Ukraine launching operations in Kursk again, Russia continuing their advances in the east. What is your sense of the lay of the land as we approach the second Trump presidency?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. Trump, rightly or wrongly, is on everybody's lips and will play a key role. I mean, he has the political and the military might to make a difference here, the US. And it's very clear that both President Zelensky and Putin are aware of that. And, Trump could enforce a peace and a ceasefire, in the next week or so. So what we've seen is I think particularly the Ukrainians have realised, and we've discussed this before, that Kursk salient in Russia, hallowed ground for the Russians, which Ukraine has held for 6 months, and more recently they put in a big effort to try and expand it, is absolutely key to this. Because you can see that in any negotiations, Putin must trade something for Kursk. We know that the Russians have taken a lot of Ukraine territory since the 24th of February 2022, and for Zelensky to get a just peace as far as the Ukraine people are concerned, there must be some trade-off there. So when you look at it on the ground, when you look at the suffering, I mean, we understand that the Russians are close to losing 1 million people, 1 million soldiers in casualties, dead and wounded, and all the hardware and everything else. We hear that their economy is in free fall, etc., etc., etc. And in the same vein, Ukraine has been absolutely decimated by this war. So I think there is a desire on all sides to come to some sort of conclusion that really suits both. And I think when you look at Putin, realizes that he must come out of this with some credit. He can't throw everything away. And Zelensky also realizes that he wants to be part of that NATO club in future. So he realizes, I expect, that he's got to do something to make sure that happens. But I am hopeful. I am hopeful that in the coming weeks that we will see a ceasefire, and it'll be interesting to see how that's monitored and dealt with. And lots of people are sort of shouting at the UK, shouting at London and the Ministry of Defence, suggesting that we might have a key role to play in it.
That's really interesting. So you actually do think that Donald Trump will be able to initiate some kind of ceasefire, if not within a day, as he famously said, but certainly within a few weeks or a few months of taking office?
I do. I think the mood music coming out of the new administration, and it's always very difficult to be, completely accurate with or interpret what Trump is saying, but the way that I've been reading it over the last few weeks, and I suppose a bit bit longer, is that Trump is sort of saying to Putin, I'm going to sort this out in 24 hours. We can do it the hard way or the easy way. And I think Putin is clever enough to realise that if Trump decides to throw the book at him, the might of the US military, then not only could Putin and the Russian forces get a severe hammering, but probably more important for Putin, it could be his end. Failed dictators rarely collect their pensions in Moscow, and I think because Putin is such a legacy figure, he's always wanted to be this great commander, this sort of Frederick the Great, Peter the Great type figure that if he gets completely hammered with this, his legacy will be gone, and I expect he will as well. So I think there is that pressure on it, and of course at the same time, Trump, not unsurprisingly, is saying to NATO European countries, you need to pull your weight. Why should America sort of do the heavy lifting for the defence of Europe? And this country, UK, needs to look at itself very deeply as well. It's no good spending on billions of pounds on everything else if you can't defend your own country. So there's lots moving here, and I am more positive that hopefully we will see the guns going silent in Ukraine in the next few weeks than perhaps I was 6 to 12 months ago.
I suppose the key question is what are the terms of any such ceasefire? Do you think if one is agreed in relatively short order, it will be favourable to Ukraine somehow, or at least acceptable to Ukraine?
Absolutely. I think it has got to be acceptable to Ukraine. I gauge Zelensky as he's a canny operator. He realises how much his country has suffered. And actually, he has the weight of the West behind him. So I think he's in a particularly strong position. Conversely, nobody has much truck with Putin. The way that he has, callously thrown so many young Russians and now young North Koreans into the sort of meat grinder, the level of casualties he's prepared to accept, the playbook, the Russian playbook developed in Syria, which I saw so often, which at its focus has attacking civilians, attacking civilian infrastructure. I think when you put all that together, it's going to be really something that Zelensky can agree to, and it would appear that Putin is putting the heavy pressure on Putin to accept. So yeah, I think that and if they can't agree a just settlement that Zelensky can agree to, then the fighting is going on, and I think nobody wants that at all. So I'm relatively confident that we'll get some ceasefire in the next few weeks or so.
And do you really think that Putin is prepared to compromise? Because a lot of the rhetoric that comes out of the Kremlin is very much, no, we want to achieve our maximalist territorial aims, we want to preserve a greater Russia. Frankly, they don't want to recognise Ukraine as a country full stop.
Yeah.
I mean, they're going to have to give on a lot of that. Do you really think Putin is prepared to? I understand you go into a negotiation, you talk a big talk, and then you retreat from that. But do you really think Putin is prepared to make the compromises necessary for a deal?
I think he's going to have to. And I think he is canny and clever enough to realise that. Because what Trump is suggesting is that he will unload the American might against Russia, and that is, we have seen, barely the surface of American military might.
And do you think Trump means that? I mean, it's General Kellogg who's specifically said that in the past, who of course is his nominated US Special Envoy for Russia and Ukraine, and he said if Putin doesn't make concessions, doesn't come to the table, they will arm Ukraine to the teeth. I'm not in much doubt that General Kellogg believes that. Does Trump believe that?
Well, Trump wants the peace. I mean, Trump absolutely, and it looks like the golden ticket of the Gaza peace might happen before Trump takes post, as it were. So, and let's hope it does, for God's sake. But that aside, this is Trump's one great opportunity to suddenly, for the whole world to actually think he is a force for good, rather than most people outside the US thinking the opposite. So I think the stakes are very high, and if Putin can create that peace that nobody else has been able to do over the last, coming up to 3 years, then I think, again, what do I know what happens in Trump's mind? But I'm sort of assuming that would be the golden egg, and that would, he would be able to ride into his second presidency on the massive crest of a wave.
What about the argument, though, Hamish, that if you had peace talks towards the end of 2025 as opposed to the beginning, Russia would be in a far weaker position and you could get a far better deal for Ukraine, not least because of the ongoing issues with the Russian economy. Inflation now in Russia is running close to 10% again. Gazprom, the big state energy corporation, is looking at potentially cutting 40% of its workforce, in part because of problems with gas exports to Europe. Europe not taking as much Russian gas as before. The value of the ruble has been a long-running issue. And of course, the cost of the war, just maintaining the war, Putin increasingly having to increase the financial incentives for Russians to sign up for the armed forces. A lot of people are saying if you waited a bit longer, those issues would really start to bite and force Putin to the negotiating table in a much weaker position.
Well, that might be right, but I think you've got to look at it passionately rather than dispassionately. Another year's war is another couple of 100,000 dead, and I don't think anybody can justify that. And the Russian economy is in free fall anyway at the moment. As far as the military goes, I think when people like me look at it, we're sort of thinking that it's going to take Russia 10 years to rebuild a military that once again NATO would look east and think, gosh, that's something that we need to be concerned about. So I think militarily now Russia is probably a spent force. Sure, if we wait another year, but I think I probably, like most people in the world, don't want to see any more death. And really want peace as quickly as possible. And if it can be done now, fine. Sure, if we wait another year, we might get an even weaker Russia. But in the long term, is that really worth waiting for? Is that worth another couple of 100,000 dead? In my opinion, no, it's not.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode of Frontline. Don't forget, you can also now listen to Frontline in podcast form. Just search for The World in 10 from wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also hear daily analysis of the biggest stories relating to war and defence. And we'll put a link to The World in 10 in the description below. Well, let's come on to your recent visit to Syria. Obviously, a lot has happened in Syria in the last couple of months. We've spoken a lot on Frontline about the fall of the Assad regime, the rise of HTS, and what next for the country. Tell me about your trip and what your key takeaways were.
Well, I think first of all, for me, going to the rest of Syria, after spending so many years in the northwest, which was predominantly the area that was besieged by Assad and attacked by Assad, was an unbelievable privilege. And having, each time I went to northwest Syria, one never was quite sure whether you were ever going to return. And I don't mean to be glib about it, but yeah, it was very dangerous, and one was aware of that. But the reason that we did this, I think, was for a much bigger cause, and that's now really shown itself and has evolved. And to be in Damascus when we were in Idlib, we looked down at this sort of evil morass of Damascus and Homs and Hama, where the Russians and the Syrians were killing people on an industrial scale. To walk around Damascus and feel, I was in Marrakesh 3 weeks ago. I felt more threatened in Marrakesh than I did in Damascus last week. So it was a great honour. And meeting everybody, 99% of people I met were entirely positive, entirely believed that there is a chance for a secular, moderate, and, in inverted commas, democratic country, and all wanting to work together and trying to get there. And frustrated in these early stages that countries like the UK and other European countries and probably the US are just sitting back, just seeing what's going to happen, because so often I hear, it's going to be Iraq 2003. And having been in Iraq 2003, I can tell you, and I've been shouting it down the streets of Westminster and Whitehall today, that it's absolutely not. And there is just this window of opportunity in this sort of eye of the storm, that if we get in there quickly, we can help realise this future for Syria that as I say, virtually every Syrian I've met wants to achieve.
And do you think, I mean, particularly with HTS and its leader, Ahmed al-Shara, do you believe they are, I suppose, the real deal when it comes to modernising the country, liberalising the country, being a moderating influence in a very difficult region? Because let's be honest, we have been here before with a whole plethora of world leaders where you start with optimism, thinking they might be a force for good, and then we find out something very different. Vladimir Putin, who we've been talking about, might be a good example. George Bush famously said, I stared into his soul and I saw a good man. Yeah. How wrong he was. What makes you confident that al-Shara and HTS are people we can do business with?
Well, that is a concern, obviously, that everybody is saying. And I saw HTS and Al-Qaeda and ISIS for many years in Syria, in northwest Syria, and they were trying to kill me. I met them last week, and they welcomed me with open arms. They're not quite the same people. I do think that they've evolved. I missed by about 6 hours the opportunity to sit down with the new leader. But the people I was travelling with did for 2 hours, sort of eight or 9 days ago. And they're people I trust and respect, and really bright, intelligent people who said, he is the real deal. What he was saying, this whole thing about secularity, about everybody mattering, trying to rebuild a country in a quasi-democratic framework, sounded very good. And then when I went around the ministries, the health ministry, they're saying exactly the same thing. I went to a reception for the elders of Homs province, the new governor and all the rest of it. And I had a long chat to the imam, the sort of head imam in Homs, and he gave a speech, and it was exactly the same. HTS seem to have got their messaging right. Everybody is going in the same direction and saying the same thing. And what's incredibly frustrating is when you see comments from people outside Syria, perhaps picking up on things. The fact that al-Shara didn't shake the hand of the French foreign minister, he put his hand on his heart, which in Syrian terms is deference to the person you're meeting. The fact you don't shake your hands actually is of no consequence, but people will say, that is a consequence. On the reconciliation side as well, and on the people talking about Alawites and others being murdered. Well, again, I didn't see that. I was aware of somebody I'm told was the chief executioner in Homs having been killed, allegedly responsible for tens of thousands of deaths. And the whole secret police network in Syria is, again, something that is difficult for us to comprehend here. But that secret police network tortured, virtually every doctor I met had been tortured by the secret police, and everybody has a family member who has been murdered by them. So again, that was a key thing, but they have got rid of. The key thing that they're after, they want to engage with the West, they want to engage with the UK, they want our advice and they want our resources. They don't want us to tell them what to do, but they want us to tell them how to do it, if that makes sense, which is completely different to Iraq 2003. When we went in there, we dismantled all the mechanisms of government, dismantled the police, dismantled the army. What HTS are trying to do is maintain all of that. And they are doing it. And they again turned the H2S soldiers, who look remarkably professional to me, and they've obviously been well trained, probably by the Turks and equipped, turned them into an army. But the other thing I noticed, there were no guns on the streets. I mean, quite bizarre. When I was admittedly, the last time I was in Idlib was 2020, and virtually everybody had an AK-47 and looked threatening. Even around some of the ministries in Damascus, there were no guns. You saw the odd, and virtually no checkpoints. Again, having done numerous tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, where these people have checkpoints all over the place, that wasn't the case. And actually, just final one on this, when we crossed the border into Syria, and the border police on the Syrian side were so polite and so welcoming and so efficient. Those of us Brits in the sort of convoy were sort of suggesting that maybe they could, get to Heathrow or somewhere like that and, do a bit of training themselves. So I know I'm possibly looking through rose-coloured spectacles, but having been there in the really bad times, having seen what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, I just judge that this is something we should throw our weight behind. And the final bit here, people I'm sure will not realise that the Syrian British diaspora are so important to Syria. The people I travel with were all, actually virtually all, doctors and consultants in the NHS, but they are dual Syrian and British nationals. But they were welcomed with open arms by ministers in Damascus, and pretty much the guys I were with, they all had very close family links to the governors and the people running Homs, which is sort of third city. And that sort of ability to influence and help is something that I hope in Westminster people realise, because it will give us tremendous influence. And the final bit here, people may be worried about us spending billions of pounds in Syria, but if we get it right, that means that the jihadi terror threat will diminish significantly. If we get it wrong, the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda and others will grab hold of Syria, and we will be back to the old days of having to, protect our borders against the jihadists.
And are you confident that the new regime is secure in its position? Because there is that question, there certainly was that question in the immediate aftermath of Assad's fall, of whether the fall of the Assad regime marked the end of the Syrian civil war, or whether it's just a significant chapter in it.
I think that's a really fair question. But I think you have to look at the sort of sequence of events and the consequences. We were all really surprised that the Assad regime folded so quickly. But as I mentioned, Hezbollah were a key part of that. They disappeared. The Syrian army itself is so corrupt that as soon as it came up against a definitive opposition, which they've never really had before, they folded. When the Russians saw everything in front of them fold, they folded and went away. It is true that we have some Kurdish elements in the northeast in particular that potentially could create additional problems here. And of course, out in the east, we have the remnants of ISIS. Now, I think the Americans did a very good job by suppressing ISIS. The Syrian Kurds, I understand, and actually I saw recently, are now talking on a very conciliatory type of manner, and are talking with the Free Syrian flag, the three-starred flag behind them. And that's what you get everywhere. Everybody is now grouping behind the new flag. So certainly there could be things happening. There are various smaller groups that may be suffering because of this. But in general, I think that the new regime have the structures, the military capability, and the desire through their, they are reaching out to all these people. And that is a message in Damascus. Come and speak to us type of thing. And the Syrian Kurds are doing that. So yeah, that is why, again, I say there is a window of opportunity. If they can't see progress, if Assad and the Russians have bankrupt the country. There is no money there at all. The petrol stations are shut. The only way to get petrol is in plastic jerry cans from the side of the road, but the country is awash with petrol. So it's things like that need to get up and running. There seems to be enough food and water there at the moment, so people are not starving. But again, I think we in Britain could take a lead because of the influence that we have there to try and get things moving forward. So I'm relatively confident that at the moment it's going in the right direction.
You mentioned the Russians. Did you pick up what may happen long term with the Russian bases there?
Well, it's a very, very, very interesting piece. Most Syrians I spoke to hate the Russians almost more than they hated Assad. They saw the Russians bombing hospitals and schools, laying waste to the place, and really because the Russians wanted to strengthen their southern flank, they wanted the Tartus naval base, and they wanted the air base in that area as well. Which is so significant for their operations in Africa and elsewhere. But there is no love lost. I mean, I heard rumours while I was in Syria that the new regime were going to do a deal with the Russians. Now, every senior person I spoke to in the new government and others said that is not happening. That is not happening if we in the West step in to support them. If give it 2 or 3 months and everybody's still prevaricating and sitting back and wondering what to do, then possibly. But I think there is no desire at all from the rank and file and even the new leadership in Syria to have anything to do with the Russians.
And how do you think HTS and the new Syrian regime will approach the wider region, most notably Israel?
That is a great question, and it's one of those really challenging areas because, of course, you know, for time immemorial, the Syrians and the Israelis have been at each other's throats. They fought in the Golan Heights, you know, various wars, and you know, really, you know, you have a predominantly Muslim country, you know, at odds with Israel, and again, seeing what's been happening in Gaza and elsewhere in the last 18 months, you would think that they were absolutely at loggerheads. But and you know, in a way, maybe that in public there is still that antagonism, but the very what so many people told me, because I asked these exactly the same question in Damascus and Homs, and they go, well, Hamish, we are only here because the Israelis have destroyed Hezbollah. So there is, I hate to say quid pro quo, but there is a realization that the destruction of Hezbollah and the Iranian militias have allowed Syria to regain its country. Now, we know the Israelis have taken a bit more of the Golan Heights and operate and occupy the Golan Heights, and not that I know anything, not that I have any insider knowledge, I can see that the Israelis, you know, are probably not going to give that up. But one sort of got the feeling that there might be the opportunity for the two countries to exist in the same area together.
Talking of Israel, just to finish, we should probably mention that on the day we're recording this, we've just had comments from the chief mediator of the ceasefire talks between Hamas and Israel in Qatar, saying he is very hopeful that we are close to a ceasefire agreement. Do you share his optimism?
Crikey, I mean, I hope so. I really, really hope so. We've had a few false dawns. The mood music around the place is that we are close to a ceasefire. So, yeah, I think we all hope and pray that is the case. And that'll be, you know, hugely significant. I mean, crikey, this year, if we can, we've got rid of, Assad's gone, we're getting a secular and moderate country in Syria, hopefully. The dreadful conflict in Gaza is over, and potentially the war in Ukraine's over. I mean, I think when we woke up on New Year's Day on the 1st of January this year, when a lot of this was uncertain, a lot of us thought, crikey, 25 is going to be a real humdinger. There are just those, you know, without wanting to be too trite, those green shoots that are potentially 25 could actually be a great year.
Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us again on Frontline.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.